In this lecture, we'll cover supply and demand theory. I encourage you to watch this particular series multiple times if need be, because the theory that I will be covering forms a basis for all of the future analysis that I will be presenting. The syllabus includes discussing the laws of supply and demand, equilibrium theory, and the determinants of supply and demand. Determinants of supply and demand is just a fancy way of saying the things that change supply and demand overall. Let's start by introducing the law of demand. What does it mean to actually demand something? In economic terms, a person demands a good if they want it, can afford it, and plan to buy it. Wants are our desires, and unfortunately for us, most of them won't be fulfilled. Looking at demand gives us an idea of what wants we see as more important relative to others. In order to demand something, we need to be able to afford it. If we can't afford it, then there's no way we would be able to buy it. So it would be irrelevant in the process of analyzing what happens in a market. The last criteria for demanding something is that the consumer plans to buy it. Again, if the consumer wants something and can afford it, but doesn't plan to buy it, it's irrelevant to us. I also want to take the time to make an important distinction. When we refer to demand, at least when we compare demand with price, we almost always will be referring to quantity demanded. The quantity demanded of a good is the amount that consumers plan to buy during a given period at a given price. Mind you, this isn't necessarily the same as the quantity bought, for reasons that may include a producer who is unable to produce enough to keep up with demand. But more on that later. For now, just remember that to demand a good, you must want it, you must be able to afford it, and you must plan to buy it. The law of demand describes an inverse relationship between the price of a good and the quantity demanded of a good. This just means that, ceteris paribus, and in general, when we increase the price of a good, we see a decline in the quantity demanded. Conversely, when we decrease the price of that same good, we expect to see an increase in the quantity demanded of that same good. Think about it in your daily life. Let's say that you were out on a hot day and you hadn't had any water in hours. You walk into a store and you see Gatorade for sale at the price of $3. You might want 2 bottles to quench your thirst. If it were priced at $6, you might only buy one, if any at all. This is a generalization that can be applied to most goods in the economy. Not all, but most. Two effects come together to reduce the quantity demanded when the price of a good increases. The substitution effect works as follows. You walk into that same store after the price of Gatorade has increased to $6, but you see a bottle of water for $3, so you buy the bottle of water instead. You have substituted water for Gatorade because the relative price of water to Gatorade is less. The opportunity cost of Gatorade increases, and so its relative price increases, decreasing its quantity demanded. The income effect describes the fact that when the price of a good increases, assuming that people's incomes remain the same, they can't afford as much of that good. Remember how in order to demand a particular quantity of a good, you need to be able to afford it? Well, if you can't afford it anymore, then you can't demand it anymore. So the quantity demanded of a good will decrease. More formally, as price increases, it increases relative to income. Thus, less of that good can be afforded, and the quantity demanded of that good will decrease. The term demand refers to the entire relationship between the price of a good and the quantity demanded of a good. It describes the prices and their corresponding quantities. We can see this relationship on a graph, as illustrated on the screen right now. The demand curve is just a graph of the inverse relationship between the price and quantity demanded when all other influences on a consumer's buying plans remain the same. As we can see, with a decrease in price, we see an increase in quantity. We can figure out a particular quantity demanded by taking any point on the curve. This works for the entire curve. If you remember the definition of marginal benefit from one of the first parts of the series on microeconomics, you'll notice a similarity. The benefit that people gain from consuming a good is measured by how much they are willing to pay for a given quantity of that good. You have some people who are willing to pay a lot for a good, and others who won't pay more than a few dollars. The amount that people are willing to pay for an additional unit of a good is called the marginal benefit. This is exactly what the demand curve shows us. When any factor other than price influences buying plans changes, we say that there is a change in demand. The graph shows an example of an increase in demand, but just know that we can also have decreases in demand. A decrease in demand would just mean that the demand curve shifts down and to the left instead of up and to the right. When demand increases, the quantity demanded at each price increases. This means that people want to buy more of the good at any price than they did before. There are 6 main factors that can cause this type of a change. The first factor is the prices of substitutes and complements. A substitute is a good that can be used in place of another. Water can be consumed instead of Gatorade. It might not be an exact substitute, but it provides the same basic benefits. If we are looking at the market for water and the price of Gatorade increases, then people will want to buy more water in general. They will want more water at $3, $4, $5, etc. It works the other way too. If the price of Gatorade decreases from its original $3, then people will buy that instead. In this case, the demand for water would increase. A complement is a good that is used in conjunction with another good. Hamburgers and fries, for example, are complements. If we are examining the market for fries and we are told that the price of hamburgers has increased, then we can infer that the demand for fries would decrease because less people would buy hamburgers and fries together, thus less people would buy fries on the whole as well. The second factor that can change demand is the expected future price of a good. If I expect that 2 weeks from now the price of a granola bar is going to increase, I might as well buy it today while it is cheaper. Thus, the demand for granola bars today would increase. In the same way, if price for granola bars was expected to fall 2 weeks from now, the demand for granola bars would decrease today. The third factor that affects demand for a good is a consumer's income. If I have more money, I can buy more books. If I have less money, then I can buy less books. I would advise a word of caution here though, because this does not apply to all goods. Let me explain. A normal good is one for which demand increases as income increases. This is what I have just described. However, there exists a type of good known as an inferior good, for which the exact opposite is true. For inferior goods, demand increases as a consumer's income decreases, and demand decreases as a consumer's income increases. A classic example of an inferior good is Spam, the meat product. For those who don't know, it's a really low quality meat-like product. As people's incomes increase, they stop buying Spam and they buy real meat like steak because they can afford it. But if their incomes decrease, then they can't afford steak, so they switch over to Spam, and thus the demand for Spam would increase. The fourth factor that could change demand is a change in expected future income. If I know that I will be earning more money in the future, I would start spending more money on any given good today. If I knew that my income was going to decrease in the future, I would save my money from now and spend less on any given good. The fifth factor that influences demand is the population. If the population increases, then the demand for any given good increases. If the population decreases, then the demand for any given good decreases. The last factor that can change demand is people's preferences. If people, for some or the other reason, begin to really like orange juice, then the demand for orange juice will increase. On the other hand, if someone proves that orange juice is bad for you, then people may not want to drink as much of it anymore, so they would demand less. I would like to reiterate this again, but all of the influences that I've just described have nothing to do with the price of a good that we are looking at. When I talked about substitutes and complements, I did mention price, but not of the good that we were looking at. I mentioned the prices of related goods. A change in the influences on buying plans can either be brought about by price or some non-price factor. If price is the factor that is changing, then it is only quantity demanded that changes, not the entire demand. This would be illustrated by a movement along the curve from one point to another. If, on the other hand, one of the 6 factors that I described earlier changes, then we can model this as a change in demand rather than quantity demanded alone. this would warrant a shift in the curve itself.